Hi Guy, welcome to the AMIGArama podcast. I'm your host Lorfarius, and for this week we will be taking a look at Defender of the Crown. Now let's jump into some news, nice and quick this week. Now I wanted to make a bit of an odd correction really. After I posted last week's episode, within minutes I saw a notification to say that the link that I'd posted to one of the games coming out, which I believe was called Mini Skies Furballs, has been cancelled. Literally within minutes. I was sat there just like look at the post thinking, I've just put that in the news, and no, it got cancelled. There is no sort of reason I think on the link. I think they're going to tackle it later, but it just annoyed me no end. If you want to go and see that, there's still videos up there. It looked quite interesting. I'll post another link into the description, so just ignore that for now. Now, another thing that did come to my attention, again, after I'd posted the Flashback episode, is back in July, a load of fans got together and basically made a re-release for the CD32 of Flashback. Now, this is pretty packed with content. It's got the WHD load slave with CD32 joypad support. Again, this didn't come out originally on the CD32. Speed corrected cutscenes. Now, you won't have seen this even from the footage, but when I was recording it from an emulator just to create the video footage, I had all sorts of problems because the video and the cutscenes where there's lots of action coming out really speeded up, and you've got to fiddle with it to get it to run properly. Now, luckily on the WHD load version, you can turn off the high speed of CPUs and all that magic, and it just works. On your CD32, it's just a standard Amiga 1200 really, but you can't seem to do that, but this fixes it. They've added a level difficulty select capability. Nice and neat. A controls screen, so you can probably mess around with the buttons. Also, a new CDXL intro derived from the 2013 remake. I think that was the one that maybe came out on Steam, but it's now been redone in Ham 8. I have no idea what that is. And new support for fast RAM equipped CD32, e.g. Terrible Fire. So, I mean, that's pretty much the ultimate edition of Flashback. So if you were tempted to go back and play it from last week's episode, then by all means, go and have a look at that link and see if it's for you. I think it should load it with some sort of emulator if you've not actually got a CD32, because they do cost an arm and a leg these days. Another thing I wanted to mention is an event coming up on the 15th and 16th of September at the Centre for Computing History down in Cambridge. Basically, you can come and meet David Pleasance, Marketing Director of Commodore UK, at our Retro Computer Festival. He will be doing book signings for his new book, Commodore The Inside Story. Will be dedicating another entire weekend to the retro computing community. The Centre for Computing History will be opening its doors on the 15th and 16th of September 2018 and welcoming enthusiasts to exhibit their personal collections, retro computing mods and hacks. Does sound pretty interesting. I will stick a link into the show notes. It's not too far for most people, I'm sure, at Cambridge, but the fact that David Pleasance himself, which is pretty much the UK bigwig when it came to the Amiga, he was behind such things like the backpack and the huge publicity that was involved with the CD32. I do remember that in particular because he did a big thing with Chris Evans. Oh, go and listen to the CD32 history episode. You should have done that by now. Just before we jump over to the episode, I just wanted to take a moment to thank everybody that's been sharing the podcast episodes online, doing different comments and things on Twitter. I'm still hoping to get more and more reviews on iTunes, because that's pretty much the bread and butter of these type of shows, because the more reviews you've got, the more chance of being found in like general searches and pushing up charts and things. And I'm pretty sure I'm not like some big chart topper or anything like that, but it would be nice to show a bit of appreciation. I'm sure a lot of you have been here right from the beginning. I mean, 45 episodes in. Please, if you can, leave some sort of review or comment and then pass info on about the show. I want it to improve and I want more people to listen. Thank you. And over to this week's game, and for this week we are going with Defender of the Crown. Now, I don't really have much of a history with this. I did play it as a kid, and I certainly remember playing it on a floppy disk or two. For some weird reason, this is like one of those big Amiga titles that everybody seems to know around. There's a lot of history and stuff. I had this weird idea at the back of my mind, and it was basically almost like a publisher or a PowerPoint, almost like presentation game. There wasn't much to it, and it was just a few graphics. But luckily, coming back to the game, and I apologise straight away, but you know, some of these I've not played for 25 years. So I mean, I have these very dodgy memories. But the thing with this show is I'm trying to go back over everything I played as a kid and a lot of stuff I've not played and try and cover them as in-depth as possible to do on the show. And I'm really glad I did. Before we get on to the actual game and reviews and stuff, I just wanted to say I had a very odd pre-perception of this game which has been with me for years, but I'm glad I sat down and went back to it because it was certainly worth it. Let's dig into it. First up, it was published and developed, I believe, by Cinemaware. Now, these guys don't really need any introduction. They were pretty much the Amiga's version of Hollywood, is probably the best way of putting it, especially with the types of games they were involved in. A few of those include things like King of Chicago, SDI, Sinbad Game, Three Stooges, Wings, It Came from the Desert. There was loads and loads of Rocket Range, you know, these massive titles that they did back in the day. They were really prolific, and it was a massive list of titles. Again, I'd be here for hours if I went through them all. The Amiga was their bread and butter, and it really does show with the history. Now, the game came out in 1986, and it was on 2 floppy disks. It was only for a single player and was priced at £14.95. Now, this was pretty much a budget title, which does show, or which they believe showed when they were developing it. The game had a couple of coders involved. The first up was Kellen Beck, who also did Rocket Ranger and Centurion, Defender of Rome, and Robert J. McCall, who was also the main game designer and the project lead, so to speak. He did Zork and Zero, The Revenge of Megaboss, which is probably the most amazing game name I've ever heard. I didn't really look into that. I just scribbled it down as a note. I wish I had now. I wonder what the hell that one is. The graphics were done by Bob Swigger, Doug Smith, Jim Sachs, who we'll cover in a bit later, John Cutter, Richard LeBaire, Rob Landeros, Salt Massid, Steve Quinn, and they were all involved with, what a list. Usually I don't go into such detail with the names, but again, this is supposed to be a budget game, and you've pretty much got like a AAA title team involved there. They all worked on things like Rocket Rangers, King of Chicago, New York Warriors, TV sports, football. I've heard some very good things about that, but I've still not to this day looked at it in more than a couple of screenshots. I need to get to it. Wings, Roger Rabbit, that must be like a version of the film, Ports of Call, and Centurion, Defender of Rome. The music was done by Bill Williams, who also worked on Defender of the Crown 2, Rocket Ranger, Sinbad, King of Chicago, Centurion, etc. Pretty much all of the Cinemaware games. And Jim Kumo, who was, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Defender of the Crown 2, and A-State, or A-State, I might have written that down wrong. Despite being a budget title and only coming on 2 floppy disks, which is about the ideal amount for that time, the game had 1.5 megabytes of graphics, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. I mean, what's it, 1.44 meg per floppy disk? Was that half density? I'm not sure, innit? But anyway, that's a hell of a lot of space taken up. It's practically the entire game. You certainly didn't see a lot of things, and the graphical detail on this must have been impressive. Now, Bob Jacob and Kellen Beck were actually inspired by the board game Risk. They also wanted to use old movies as a basis to come up with an idea for a game. So they actually used storyboards like you do in movies to design the way it all plays together and work through it in sections. Now, this was something that was extremely new and impressive for the time, because no one really went to this sort of level. You'd come up with a random idea and maybe jot it down on a bit of graph paper and that was it. No, these guys sat down and came out with proper storyboards and put all the different sections up almost like it was a movie. It's probably the sort of thing they were doing across all the other Cinemaware games as well. Jim Sachs, of course, was the lead when it came to the graphics. Everyone seems to think that he did all this on Deluxe Paint at the time, but this is an incredibly early Amiga title, you know. Deluxe Paint didn't exist. It hadn't even come out yet. There was no like Tutankhamun art front or anything. So he actually used something called graphic craft, which was something that wasn't really used beyond the early years, especially when Deluxe Paint, it was pretty much the end of it. And he used it to great extent, pretty much to do every scene and graphics. A lot of thing with the graphics in this game is a lot of them move. It's not like static images and stuff. It was quite impressive what he actually did as artwork. Jim's Amiga artwork in general is quite famous. It's featured on all sorts of like ads and leaflets, and pretty much when anyone looks to Amiga art, one of the first people they think of is Jim Sachs, and he has a huge history. And is it like a bibliography of Amiga? It's more like a portfolio, isn't it? But it's well worth tracking down some of his stuff on Google. I think he has a website dedicated to it as well, because he really did go way above and beyond a lot of artists did at the time. On the music side, Jim Kumo was actually told to listen to the original Adventures of Robin Hood film because they wanted that sort of a feel and an environment, and he used it for an inspiration to do all the piano pieces that are dotted throughout the game. It's actually quite unique music, but it's set up with like a medieval, almost English-y theme to get you through the general sections, and it almost feels like it's medieval in tone and lots of plush instruments, and again it's all played on piano pieces. It's just such an impressive way of putting music across. Despite being a budget game, it was a huge undertaking, which is why it had so many people involved on it. This is the early days of the Amiga, and it was falling apart. No one really had any control about it. There was lots and lots of different sections working either against each other or struggling to come together with an overall plan. And then after a while, Robert J. Mickle came along and sorted it all out, reorganised everything and cleaned up how stuff was going and organised the department stuff. And he basically drew together all the music, the graphics and the coding and made it into the product that we pretty much ended up with. Now, for financial reasons, the game had to be rushed out for Christmas 1986. The development team were actually working 20-hour days to get it done in time, so several weeks constantly working to deadlines to try and push this through. And one of the biggest problems they had is the sword fighting sections that you see in the game. They're all 2D side-on affairs moving from left to right. It's very, very simplistic. They effectively ran out of time, and originally the idea was to match what they had in other parts of the game where they had like horse riding. Sorry, you're on a horse back riding along as a knight with your javelin trying to knock other people off. Originally that was going to be how the sword fighting was done, all first person based, and you could see that would have blown up that section to something completely different. And I think, to be honest, with what we ended up with, it was fun enough and it was functional, but it would have been even more amazing if you'd been able to walk around like swinging your blade around and fighting back and stuff against other knights and enemies. So it was a shame that they just couldn't pull it together in time to get that full section in. This was of course ported to 1,000,001 systems, but the Amiga port is quite famous because it by far has the best graphics and sound. That's been confirmed by the actual team in multiple interviews. The Amiga version was even ported over to iOS much later, I think around 2012, which is quite a functional version as well. I think I've got a copy of it still stashed on my iPad. I do look at from time to time. They cleaned it up a bit around the edges and the menus and stuff, but it's effectively the Amiga games. The ports that were available were for the Commodore 64, DOS, Apple II, Atari ST, Amstrad, that'll be the CPC, CD-TV, CDI, NES or NES, depending on which part of the world you're in, the Game Boy Advance. They also worked on a ZX Spectrum version, which was fully complete, I believe. I'm not sure. I think the development files went missing or something. There's not much of a story behind that, but it ended up stuck in someone's cupboard somewhere, and they re-released it recently and did Cinemaware did a fancy box for it, and you can still buy, I think, a copy of that online today, and it comes in a tape with a fancy case and all these little extras inside. It looks pretty great from what I was looking at in the pictures. As mentioned before, there was a sequel to this, just called Defender of the Crown 2, which was developed and designed by Jim Sachs, because this was pretty much his lead game and idea for most of the time. That came out in 1993, but it was only ever released for the CD-TV. Now, that system itself was a complete failure, and not many people got to play it, but luckily with emulation and WHD load, you can play that version today. And it's not anything new. They don't change the game massively, but they saw a lot of the original bugs. They expand it a lot more. It's more graphically likable. They clean up a lot of stuff around the edges. The animation is improved a lot. It's probably the better version than the original game. But again, if you've got fond memories of the original and you're going back, you don't really want to go and bother with the second one, because I think it changes it too much that it's too different for it to be classed as the same thing. What a very odd thing to say. Yeah, they're effectively the same game. Maybe it's Defender of the Crown 1.5. I'm not sure what else to call it. Let's have a look at the game story. It is a time of legends, a time for heroes, a time of bitter strife, when great men rise above their peers to perform great deeds. A chapter of history is in the making. Your liege the king is dead, the throne vacant. Britain enters a season of destruction, a winter of killing that can end only when the last brave Saxon knight lies dead, or the castles of the Normans lie in the heaps of rubble, emptied of the foul oppressors who have enslaved your people. It is a time when foreign invaders shall learn truths administered by the shining blades of Saxon swords. It is a time when heroes are made and legends are born. Oh my god, what an awesome introduction. That's pretty much the entire story of the game. Now, when you do open it up at first and start a game off, you do get a little bit about like Robin Hood style and how everything's going on with the Saxons and things, but it doesn't set the scene as amazingly as that. There's a few bits of text boxes here and there, but it's almost poetic. Now, the game itself is effectively a strategy sort of board game with the different sections working together, and it's going to be a hard one to do to cover for an interview. When you first start off, you're presented with a map of England. It cuts off Scotland at the top, which will probably please a few Scots that are listening. But, you know, when you first begin, you can see a full map of merry old England. There's all the different factions and countries split off into different sections. There's a castle in certain lands. Effectively gives you a plan of where you can go and what you can do. Before you begin though, you are given a choice of 4 characters to choose from. They all have different strengths and weaknesses. First up is Wilfred of Ivanhoe, Cedric of Rotherwood, Geoffrey Longsword, and Wolfred the Wild. Now, I don't think any of these are actually famous individuals or actually real, as I'm quite sad to say. Now, all of the game that you see, from all the map screens and all the text, it's displayed on, it's almost as if it's on scrolls. And what I mean like that is you are looking at a brownish scroll with all the curled bits of paper around the edges and the tears and stuff, and it's all yellowed with age and that sort of brown yellowish colour, and all the text is like this, and it looks very, very neat. It sets the scene straight away for this almost king-like strategy game that you're going to play. Now, as I said, each character does have a different rating of things that they can actually do, and that's split between leadership, jousting, and sword play. Some are strong in it, strong in things like sword play or jousting, which makes the mini games or the different sections of the game easier depending on the skill level of the player, but none of them are overly too strong in everything. They all tend to verge from average to strong a little bit in different areas, and it does add some replayability to the game, because if you start with a different character, it can make each section either very hard or very easy depending on how you play. You can't really upgrade that skill or anything as you're going through the game, I'm afraid to say. So you are pretty much stuck on that path of just 4 players. It is very Risk-like in the sense that the aim of the game is to capture land and other players' castles. You get a choice of things to do, like hold tournaments, seek conquest, so invading other lands, go raiding, build an army, read the map, you know, you can flick it back and forth. It's very, very basic graphically in that sense, except that it's not just a case of, oh, you've just got these menus and text menus to flick back and forth. Everything is covered in these absolutely gorgeous graphics, especially for the time, because you've got to remember this is the mid-80s and they've never really been anything like this to this degree. These aren't just still images that it presented with as like backgrounds. Let's say you go to the tournament, it loads up at first and you think, oh, it's just a picture of a tournament ground with the ground on where the horses can run back and forward. The characters actually move and the graphics do. It's like I'm not sure what to call it. It's a visual sort of animation. It's very early. It works really, really well. And what you think might be a still image, let's say you're looking at a castle and then there's water, but there might be like part of a waterfall moving, or there'll be enough pixels flicking in spaces so it looks like it's active. It's a very strange effect, but it works really, really well, and it really did impress me. And I just thought as I was playing it, it's like, wow, this really does feel like you're in medieval times. Even if it's simple things like the movement of the horse as you're riding down during the jousting matches and the horse is bobbing along and you're bobbing on the back. It's a still image, but there's movement within it. Even simple things like looking at flames at a fire. The introduction has that when you're first getting told the opening sprawl of your character. You're all sat around a campfire, but the fire isn't just a still image. The flames are crackling away, and it's not crackling in the sense there's like great sound effects, sadly, but you actually see movement in them and it feels very, very active. Like I say, there's a couple of modes that you can play. Whole tournament, that lets you joust in first person. You basically get on the back of a horse. You've got a shield and a big javelin. If you don't know what that is, it's effectively like a spike, a big steel spike. Or is it iron? I'm not sure. No, it'll be steel. Anyway, get on your back of your horse. You go charging at another person. They come riding towards you. It's sort of like gladiatorial? Yeah. Sort of combat at night against night. And they're charging towards you, you're charging towards them, and you have to like use the mouse to aim the end of your javelin, and you either aim at part of their head or part of their shield, and the idea is you're trying to push them off. And from everything I know about horse racing, jousting on horses, it's effectively like two trains running towards each other with a spike on the front, and it's which one has enough power to knock the other one off the back of the horse to win. A very, very simple game, but the great thing about it is because you've got like the bobbing as you're moving, you're not actually running down there. I might have said that a bit wrong. You're not actually running down the track. You don't see that. You are just sat in one spot and the surround doesn't move. The horse that you're sat on bobs up and down and you can move the weapon and the other character moves towards you. And it gives you the impression that it's all very interactive and there's a lot going on. It's very, very convincing. And I like the way that you get to aim at another body part or another section of a person, and when you knock them off, you do get to see the after effects. It shows a side-on view where they get flung off the horse and a nice satisfying clunk. You do get to play a few challenges timed in for that, and you can gamble and bet things like fame or land. I mean, for the time, it's just a bit of a fun gamble with a nice little reward, and it lets you win other sections of the map. And when you gamble and you see, I want to bet for land, you pick a section that they own, and then if you win, it belongs to you, and you can offer the same as well. And if they win, you lose that section of land. As soon as it's an entire game about conquering all of England, it can be a bit problematic. Now, if you learn how to do that game, it can be a bit easy really, but some of the characters, especially as the game gets further and further, are quite tough. It's not straight. It's not like, oh, always aim in that spot, you will always get them. There's always seems to be a sweet spot, and with the amount of bobbing and the movement and stuff, it can be a fun gamble to do. In between things like matches, you get the opportunity to build an army, of course. You can expand that with things like soldiers, knights, catapults, and buying castles for different sections of land. If you own castles, you can do things like raiding and things. All of them cost gold. You have a very piddly amount when you first start off. I think it's 15 to 20 gold pieces. That is not a lot at all, especially when some of these things like soldiers and knights can cost like a big old chunk of cash. So the only way you can win money is by raiding or going to like the big events and winning competitions and things, because you do win cash prizes, which lets you build the army. Of course, when you've got this army, you can basically send them forth, and that lets you attack other castles. You actually get to see like a nice graphic of the actual castle, and you get to line up a catapult and sling it through the air and destroy part of the wall. And when you've done enough sections, your entire army will go charging through, and they'll either conquer the castle or win some prize or something like that. The entire aim of it is just to tear enough of a big enough gap in the wall and effectively destroy part of their army. Now, it's very basic aiming at that part. It's almost like a mini game. You can use the mouse to move the catapult back and forth to judge the distance, and then when you draw it back and press the mouse, it flings a massive boulder to bring it down. It's quite simplistic, but at the same time, it's a fun little mini game which works really well. You can also do map-based attacks. That's basically where you just send out your army to start kicking some butt. And you can do simple things in that, like capture land, which in turn, you get more gold from that because you're effectively getting taxes. That's the time. You're getting taxes off other people, and that in turn gives you more money and lets you build your army. And you're building up the strength of your army to conquer the rest of England, but the other players can do the same as you. So it's all like little gambles and tournaments and little mini games. There's also the opportunity to go raiding the castles. That's effectively like rescuing a maiden. Now that's quite simple, and I think I mentioned it before. It's a side-on view with just two single screens. They're not scrolling. So you appear in the castle courtyard. You have to work your way through. You've got a couple of characters. There's like 3 characters at a time. Your main one you control at the bottom. You can use your sword. You just press the button and it taps really quickly. If he's losing, he gets pushed back. If you're winning, you can press further and further. As you go onto the second screen, you can see the entranceway into the maidens' chambers, and the idea is to beat the other person in front of you to win the castle and make your way through. Now, the great and funny thing about that is if you do actually make it through, you will capture the maiden's young heart, and there is quite I don't know, it's not really erotic per se, but you get to see some kissing and hints of like silhouettes behind curtains and a man and a woman kissing and things, and it's very, very risque, especially for the time. I'm sure for young kids and teens playing for it, it would have been all part of the fun of, you're going in there, conquering this castle, and you've won her over. And then when you do actually win her over at the end, she does appear on the map as like a head icon at the top, and it just improves the morale and stuff in your army. Well, it doesn't really, but the point is she's there. It's very active. It's that Adventures of Robin Hood style of entertainment. It works great. One of the oddest things about it is, the music's great because there's a fair chunk of it. There's no like sound effects. Like one of the annoying things that really stood out in my mind is when you're lobbing these boulders at the castle walls, you'd expect some sort of crash or bang of wall, so even when you bring them down, there's nothing. There's just silence. You're effectively just doing it all on the quiet. And the music does play, but it's almost like sporadic throughout the entire game. It's like horns and trumpets, and it's off piano, and it sounds great. Again, there's not any sound effects from within the game itself, so sometimes it's a bit head scratching. You think it could have done with being a bit more interactive and a bit more expansive on the sound effect. Like, again, do not get me wrong, the music is fantastic, but I just like having more things going on with the sound effects. Now, I'll have to say it again and again and again, but the graphics in this, especially for time, are absolutely gorgeous. It's lots and lots of like medieval scenes and castles and buildings, knights and soldiers, and the whole jousting section of it. The artwork is really incredible. The fact that it's almost interactive but not, you think this looks like a still image, and there's the movement there, and it just creates this great, it's almost like an atmosphere of real world, and it just comes across as being very, very convincing, and it just suits the game perfectly. Despite waxing all lyrical, it does have its problems. Every game does, I'm afraid to say. Despite being a strategy game, there's not really much strategy involved, and it's very easy to complete. It does feel like a budget game in that sense. A game will probably take you around about 20 minutes tops to get through, even if you're struggling. And the thing is, if you lose the game, that's it. It just, you effectively just reset, and you can just come back to it constantly. And there is enough difference there, at least from playthrough to playthrough, that there's enough going on to keep you entertained. I would have liked a bit more to do, especially we had that hint of the first person knight play, say, but that's just not there, and it's a real shame. It just feels like it needs a lot more mini games. We've only got a couple chucked in, and you've got the bits with them. I mean, the maps are effectively managing menus and numbers. They look very nice, and it's interactive enough. They could have expanded it out just a bit more, but as I said originally, they ran out of time. They were desperate to get this out, especially for Christmas, so it's understandable, and I suppose it is a budget game. It does leave me with a feeling that there isn't a lot to do, but one thing I do like about it is the whole game feels grander than what it actually is, because you're aiming to conquer a place and you are battling to take on different sections of the company. And yeah, it's just a basic board game effectively, but it feels like something bigger. It feels like there's a lot more going on, and I think that's because of the jousting and the raiding and stuff, and the trying to save the maiden. There's lots of little mini games there, but they all work together enough to provide a greater whole. But I really just wanted a little bit more. I'm sure they could have, with maybe a few more months, they could have squeezed in an extra mini game. There's also no save game whatsoever, but again, it doesn't really need one because the games are incredibly short. There's a fair few times it feels like in a way like a flash game or something, something that you used to play on the internet that you can just sink a little bit of time into, have some fun, and then walk away from. But there's a few sections when you're doing really incredibly well, and you can stretch some games out for pushing on over 30 minutes, and you just think, I'd like to manage this a bit more and maybe keep the game where I'm up to, but you just can't do it. The worst part of it for me, especially with the mini games, has to be the sword fighting. It looks nice, and I can understand why they did that. It would have been so much better if they got that first person knight sword fighting chucked in there, because I really like the idea of that, because the jousting works just really well. It's quite convincing, it's very clever. It's all tricks, of course. It makes you think that you're jousting, but you're not really, because you're just stuck in the spot, but it feels better. And I could just imagine what that would have been like with the sword play. But the fact is, we haven't really got very many of these mini games, and something like this one, it feels a bit of a waste. And in some regards, it reminds me of the sword fighting on not on Monkey Island, though, even though that was awesome, but no, the Sid Meier's Pirates. That's a similar sort of thing, with moving back and forth and bouncing off other players. That was a lot more complicated. It felt like you could spar, you were parring off hits and knocking things away. There's nothing like this in this one, because you're just moving from left to right. They can push you back, you can push that. It's really basic, and it's just a shame. It feels like a budget game. It looks great, it's a bit of fun, but it's a very quick thing to play through. Again, that's not a bad thing by all means, because like budget games are meant to be something quick and easy to complete and bought on the cheap, and this certainly manages all this and more. See, there's not a lot of game here, but what is there is really done well, so there's not too many bad things I can complain about. Now, the magazines of the time, most of them didn't exist. It really was a tough one to try and get out information. Most of the ones that did do reviews for it were re-releases at the time. CU Amiga gave one version 82%. Zap, which seems to cover Amiga games to some degree, did 78%. Oh, it's not too bad. Amiga Joker, which I think is a German magazine, they gave it 72%. The One, 4 out of 5. And ACAR magazine gave it 96%. Again, this is for the re-release version, and that came out much later down the line, because again, this was a mid-80s game and none of them really existed before that, so it's interesting that they even went back to it. But again, that's still got a good spread of scores there. I mean, it feels like a 7 or 8 out of 10 game. It also seems to be one of the fondest and most remembered Amiga games when I'm talking to Amiga fans, especially like games they remember from back in the day. This is one of the ones that always comes up from most people. It's very short and sweet, but has a lot of replay value. It's very much an on-the-spot budget game. It's perfect for what it's doing and what it's trying to do. The biggest problem is that I just wanted to do more with it. I wanted more minigames, wanted to just be a bit more involved. Maybe if they'd been able to get a third disc or more minigames, it would have just been really amazing. Its biggest plus is that it really feels like you're taking part in like a 50s or 1950s, 60s Hollywood movie, and I can see why they based it around like the adventures of Robin Hood, because they really have captured that in spirit. And you're not playing with Robin Hood or anything, but there's that feel to the game, and it feels like you're taking on the arm. There's no King John or anything like that. The fact that you're very involved with it, you get hints of a story dotted around, and you're saving the maiden and effectively Maid Marian and stuff, and the princess is almost thrown in there. It works well for that. It creates a decent environment. It's very cinema-like, and effectively this was by Cinemaware because it was their first game. I can see why it was re-released on iOS, because that seems to be like the perfect place now to pick it up and play it, because if you've got an hour or so, you don't even need an hour, 20 to 30 minutes set aside, you want something to have a quick bash on, this is the perfect game for it, because it's really fast, easy and fun to play. Yeah, I suppose you don't really need the saves, you could have done with a bit more, but graphically, even going back to it today, it still looks very, very impressive. And yes, later games and stuff will have done much more to improve things, but again, you look at around about 85, 86 when, especially in the UK, the likes of like the ZX Spectrum and the C64 were king, and then you look over at the Amiga and you've got something like this hitting the market, and it's almost mind-blowingly beautiful. It's just got such gorgeous graphics, and it really does look amazing, and it looks the part, especially with that music. I will say that strategy games, especially to this type, are certainly not my thing, but I really didn't need to sit down with like pages and pages of a manual to learn what was going on. A couple of minutes poking your way around through the menus, and effectively a couple of restarts at first because I was trying to remember how it played. There's not much to it. You can pick it up really quick and easy, and that's probably why it was quite popular as an iOS port, because there's not much to learn. It's pick up and play. It's a perfect basic little game. It's very throwaway, it's very budget-like in a good way, because in fact that's what it's supposed to be. Now, hopefully, and I know I mentioned it earlier, the CD TV sequel, I would hope, I didn't play that in depth, I only had a quick look around the edges at pictures and maybe watched a couple of video things. I'm sorry guys, but I'm trying to rush the stuff through on the first game, but I would hope that the CD TV version expands on it a lot more. I know it had some graphical improvements and it's effectively the same game, but I would hope there's a lot more tucked away that I've not seen, but I might be wrong. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the show. As usual, I would like to thank all of our Patreon supporters. They are Adam Bradley, Figgy/CTZ, Graham Vebke, Jason Warnes, O'Brien's Retro and Vintage, Retro Ravi, Sneff and Treble. If you would like to help out and support the show, you can join that incredible team on patreon.com/AMIGArama or pop along to AMIGArama.com. You can even leave me a message on the Facebook page, which is facebook.com/AMIGArama, or just email me on Lorfarius@AMIGArama.com. I'm always looking for emails, maybe like audio logs or things I can add to the show, ideas and stuff like that. I really want you guys to get involved. And really, if you don't want to do any of that, you can always pop along to iTunes or whatever podcast program you are using, and by all means, please leave me a review, because it is appreciated and it helps the show get out there and be introduced to more and more people. Until next time, guys.